Hello, welcome to the Art of Renovation Live. I'm your host, Paul Foster from Contact Renovations and Custom Homes. This week we're talking about insulation. Doesn't sound exciting? Well, you'll wait and find out. There's a lot of things in the insulation world that'll have a direct impact on your home and how it performs. And there's a lot of technologies that have improved. So if you're in a 50s bungalow and what you have now in a build nowadays, there's a very different system and expectations are much higher of how your house will perform. So tune in. We'll talk with Bobby Franklin from Details Insulation, and they're experts in their field, and they'll help to explain to us all a bit about what to look for in your home and how to identify if you maybe need to put a bit of attention into your insulation and if you need repairs and what products to use, because there's also a lot of different ways to insulate, whether it's your wall, floor systems, or your attic. There's many different ways to do it now, many different products. So it's good to be in the know and understand what's out there and what works best for you. So I'll see about bringing Bobby into the call here. Bear with me. There he is. Comes in here. All right, Bobby.
Paul.
All right, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
All right. I didn't really give you an intro, so I guess we'll get into that now. So Details, you guys have been in business since 2007. On the residential side, you have extensive experience with large-scale renovation, custom or infill estate homes, net zero, and off-grid and passive homes, right? As well as engineered building envelope repair. So you've been around the block, you know a lot about it and how it impacts. Like a renovation particularly is what we're talking about today, and how to retrofit products into a home, identify where there's issues, right? So so there you go. Welcome to the show. I'm just going to pull up a couple images here so we can show in the background a bit of what's going on. And we got a giveaway item as usual. We've got a couple cool Yeti Rambler, coffee mugs, or use them for what you want. Coincidentally, there's also some coffee that comes with this. Oh, where'd my picture go here? Oh, he's got some right there. And they happen to be foam insulated as well. There we go. So we got some Laker Co. coffee beans to go with it. So the question today, the skill testing question is what R value per inch is spray foam? All right, so we'll talk about that a bit later. For now, if you know the answer, put it in the comments, and we'll do a random draw at the end of the show, somewhere around 150, something like that today. So in the meantime, we are going to talk a bit about, looking for a format that's going to work here. All right, well, there you go. So we'll talk about insulation. And one thing to point out right now, when I did the artwork for the cover, I picked a product that you don't use. So let's start with
wasn't going to say
foam.
that, but yep. Nope, we don't use that one.
So we'll start with spray foam only because I screwed up the cover. And let's talk a bit about why spray foam comes in different colors and what those colors represent. And then from there, we'll kind of get back on track with talking about looking for problems in your house and et cetera.
Sure. Okay. So that the color actually is primarily a Canadian thing. So in Canada, there's quite a bit more regulation and far more extensive than south of the border. And so for any certified application, meaning essentially a building that's going to be occupied, if people are going to live or work in that building, you have to use a certified product. And so that means that the people installing it have training, licensing, the company does. There's third-party quality assurance, so sort of an independent body that oversees the training, the manufacturing, the licensing. And part of that for Canada is that each one of those certified foams has to be easily identifiable for an inspector. So each brand has a different color, and that will be indicated on their data sheets. So their CCMC number, for example, that product would be Wall-Tite, which is a BASF product. It's a good foam for sure. People recognize it often from TV. A lot of marketing for that one, but really good product. Nothing wrong with it at all. It's just so that inspectors know which product it is, so that it matches the licensing and also the sticker. There's always a sticker left on the panel, typically in the house, showing who installed the product on what date, what the licensing information was. So yeah, just so that you can easily identify it.
Sure. Well, it makes sense. So sorry for grabbing the wrong one. Looking for some cover images here.
Okay.
I thought it was a nice shot that depicted kind of the
A
act.
nice shot, yeah.
So I guess we're talking about spray foam now. So let's get into it a bit more, then we'll switch on to our other topics here. So the questions I get primarily when I recommend often that we spray foam our rim joists and anything that's cantilevered. We go right to spray foam, or if there's a structural wall and I need to insulate it and I don't have room for an air gap, then I'll go spray foam. And our clients generally will ask, especially if they have a family living in the house, what about the off-gassing? You know, can I be in my home while you're actually spray foaming? So let's talk a bit about that so people can understand what to expect if they are going to have spray foam involved in their reno.
Okay. So we'll start with, I guess, the off-gassing, or we'll start with, can you be in the house? That's probably a good one. So house building doesn't matter. Anytime there's spray foam being installed, you can't be in that house, can't be in that work area. In fact, within 10 meters, you need to be on supplied air and fit tested respirators. So pretty extensive safety requirements for that. And that's because essentially when we're installing spray foam, imagine that we're manufacturing it in the home, office, shop, whatever that site is you're taking two products, heating them, putting them under pressure, monitoring both of those steps to make sure they're accurate. But then assembling that, like when you see a spray foam gun like that picture you had and it's coming out the end all purple, the first time those two chemicals meet is actually in that gun. So they're kind of reacting in between the gun and that wall or whatever substrate's being sprayed. So during that, you can imagine there's a fair amount sort of released into the air as that reaction is happening. And so that's why you see that installer there is wearing, looks to be a full face mask and supplied air, which is monitored and actually brought in from, in our case, out from the truck with 4-stage filtration so that they're safe, they're fit tested annually. So yeah, inside house when you're spraying it, no, definitely not. Can't be in that area.
When can they come back in? Say are they out for the day, or are they staying overnight somewhere and coming back the following day?
Yeah, so the standard for, again, is a Canadian thing. So what would apply to us is 24 hours to occupy the space after the completion of foam. So if you're spraying that day, it's 24 hours after the end of the day when we're done spraying. And fairly limited ventilation is required. So that standard is 24 hours. There's no way to accelerate it. It's 24 hours with a minimum of 0.3 air changes per hour. So that's really tight. So for context, that's like net zero passive air tightness, like very, very little ventilation. And I think my kind of understanding of why that is in place is that what you don't want to do is have a situation where you say, oh, well, if you open all the windows, it's only 1 hour, right? Because how do you monitor that accurately and say, well, you're exchanging the air 12 times an hour versus 0.3. So 0.3 is very unlikely to be that tight at that stage with, the house isn't done, painted, sealed, all that yet. So 24 hours, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so if you're planning a reno, and especially doing a basement development, and we do a lot of those, and we generally always suggest that the rim joists are spray foamed, especially in an older home. Some of the newer homes will come with an insulated rim that don't need additional spray foam, but always make sure that you know as a homeowner that when your contractor's coming in and they want to spray the rim, that you need to be out for a night, and be ready to, just clear the home and come back and, whether you go see your family or book a hotel, whatever it is, right? So if your contractor hasn't given you that heads up, then I think you need to ask some questions quickly about, well, why not?
Right? It's one of those things, Paul, to be honest, is I kind of see it as a bit of differentiating factor. And I think that whether we're dealing directly with the homeowner or in your case, the general contractor, is that it's not uncommon for home contractors to try to want to find a way for that to be a bit shorter, right? Because it can be a big obstacle to the sale for a homeowner. You got to move your kids out, go find somewhere to stay for the night, or for a general contractor, it's a question of, I can't have any other trades in there. I got to wait a day. So it does take some planning. So to me, it's something where I think it shows what that contractor is concerned about, whether it's your safety, following the rules, or is it kind of getting that job and getting it done. But I think that's important, and it's something that we're pretty open about right from the very beginning, because that way you can plan your trades. Or in the case of, let's say we're spraying basement joist ends for a homeowner, then often we'll suggest like, hey, maybe let's book this on a Friday so that that's a good day for you guys to be away. and try to accommodate scheduling there. But yeah, it is definitely important to be out of the home.
Absolutely. I think like spray foam has a bunch of benefits, and I think this photo is a good example of one of them. So we've always been kind of told as contractors and maybe as a homeowner, like you can't have plumbing in an exterior wall, and we generally try to avoid it where we can. But I think that now with some of the new spray foam technologies out there, we're able to put some lines into exterior walls now. Let's talk about this picture, Bobby, and how this works and how come you can get away with that now.
So in that one, I don't remember exactly why that plumbing would have had to be there, but there's always a reason. Maybe it just, there's not enough room to fur that wall out to fit a full-size tub or whatever it might be. In that one, so you have fiberglass on either side and then spray foam in the middle. And the plumbing is, it is in an exterior wall, but because the foam doesn't require the full depth of that cavity to get the insulation value required and the vapor barrier, in fact, it's behind that water. So those water lines are actually on what we would call the warm side of the wall. Even though they're inside the wall, they're ahead of the foam. So for all intents and purposes, that's the warm side of the wall. So on either side of that, the fiberglass and traditional vapor barrier is used, and it's not a bad product necessarily. It comes with some limitations. Each have their advantages, but certainly the advantage of fiberglass is cost is significantly less. And foam, I think that's a good example of using foam for what it's good at. And that's something sort of we try to bring to the table, because we don't just install foam, fiberglass, blown insulation, whatever that might be, is about trying to find the right product for the right space. So if that one, for example, either the budget or maybe the priority wasn't really efficiency, then in that one we would have used foam where, okay, here's some spots where just for sure you have to use it. Like there's no other way to do that cavity well. Joist ends, like you said, cantilevers are a great space to use it. So yeah, foam in that case gave us the flexibility to be able to keep water where they wanted it to be without building that wall out, but also still knowing that those water lines are protected by the foam insulation behind it.
Absolutely. Well, I think we'll move on from foam. It'll come back into the conversation later because it can be used in a variety of ways. We'll talk about vapor barrier a bit later too, and that's another great way that you can take advantage of spray foam, especially in a renovation in an older house. So we're going to show some pictures from a project that we're doing right now, and you're going to be working with us on it. So we have this 50s bungalow, and this is, we're kind of through some of the demo now, but you can kind of see what used to be the kitchen up at the ceiling level. There's some old wall headers up there, and someone did a renovation previously. And these wall headers, we need to take them out. We're going to redo the ceiling, and it'll open the space up and get that awkward line out. So we demoed this wall header system. Here's what we had left. Now it's plaster ceilings, of course. So now we've got the double top plates out. And now we have a bit of a conundrum for finishing, because that's an ugly patch, and you can't tell from this photo, but we've got a 3/4 inch difference in heights on the ceiling on either side of where those headers came out. So as we kind of got into the removal here, I'm just looking for another photo that seems to have moved, but make a long story short, we decided to take off the plaster, and we found 3 types of insulation there. And first thing we did is we had this wax paper backing on there, so you couldn't really tell from below exactly what you're working with. So then we pulled it off, and here we go. We've got some wood chip. We've got some old, looks like cellulose, I guess, or chop in there, and some cut up fiberglass as well, it looks like.
All the stuff.
So I think this will use as a segue to talk about what you're going to run into in your renovation a little bit. So here you can see over the years they've done some topping up and they've improved performance, but now we're stuck with this mismatch of products. And you can even see some white fiberglass insulation bats jammed in there at a certain point too. So this has been through a few renos, this house. But I guess, what I'm leading to here is, here you have, as a contractor or a homeowner doing it yourself, now you need to figure out what are you going to do next, right? And at this point, we've already committed to taking it all out, and we're gonna top up. And we talked to this homeowner about, what do we do now? Do we upgrade all of the insulation in the attic? Do they have budget for that? Or do we address just this one area here? And in that home already, we already stripped some plaster walls off, and we've upgraded the exterior insulation on the exterior walls from the inside. And it's kind of one of those things where it's still a 50s bungalow. It'll never perform like a new home, but there's so many options, and I think often people don't know which direction to go. So, you know, when someone runs into, I guess, finding something like this in their home, you have this mismatch of insulation, and if you found this from above, I think you really have a couple options. The code now is R60 in an attic, and not all houses can take R60 depending on your roof slope. But like, what would you recommend people do when they find something like this? There are multiple layers built up over the years. When do you recommend sucking it all out or dropping it, and how would you proceed?
Well, I would say first of all, that's not atypical at all to have 50s bungalow. Wood chips would have originally only had wood chips. In the 80s, there was a program called the CHIP program, which sort of incentivized upgrading to R20. So there's often a layer of cellulose on top of that. And then in the years that followed that, again, probably another upgrade that followed that. Like you said, with that bat that's in there, to me, that looks like a bit of a renovation. Maybe they had some issues around something, you know, someone did that from the top. As far as when to take it out, I think that depends a little bit on the scope of the renovation. So none of those insulation pieces or types, you know, they can get along just fine. There's no reason they can't work together. Really, the biggest disadvantage there would be that when something's had that many renovations and changes, is, you know, can you see what's going on underneath them? So I would say in this one especially, let's say, for example, they weren't dropping the ceiling, and you're going to do a bunch of electrical work. In my mind, removing the insulation gives you full access to the space that you're working in. It gets you an opportunity to be able to inspect and repair the vapor barrier, or find out that maybe it doesn't have one. You can find penetration, so big holes that you wouldn't otherwise be able to see. And then lastly, it also gives you definitely a more manageable workspace. So imagine as any other trade contractor, whether it be your electrician, your plumber, you know, or the general, to be, you know, up there kind of checking out work and things like that. Where is a more likely space to get good quality work done? Is crawling through 12 to 18 inches of various types of insulation, kind of swimming through that, hoping for the best, or a space that's cleaned out that you can see and work in. And so depending on the scale of the reno, sometimes even just doing that removal, it will reduce the labor cost of those other trades. So your labor costs can go down a little bit, which is a nice thing. And then secondly, your quality of work is generally going to be better because you can see what you're doing. And then lastly, it gives you an opportunity to see other issues. So in this one, for example, you know, dropping the ceiling, you can of course see the vapor barrier issues or lack thereof. Taking that out, yeah, I mean, the advantage would be that sometimes you can have too much insulation. And often homes, it's not unusual for us to go into one and they said, well, I've had these upgrades done, I've got tons of blown insulation, but I'm still having problems. And it's not really an issue of insulation. They want to add more. It's then becomes an issue of air tightness, and it's you know, we have blocked ventilation, air leakage into the attic, and adding more isn't good. In fact, in lots of ways, this might sound a bit counterintuitive, but if you had to pick which one to be better, in some ways, you're almost better from a preservation of your house to have adequate ventilation and inadequate insulation versus the other way around. As long as both are sealed, like vapor barrier is very important. In this one, I'd say, yeah, you can take it out, you can clean it up. If it had wood chips first, it's not going to have insulation stops built into it unless they were added during one of those subsequent top-ups. So it also means by taking it out, you get a chance to make sure that your soffit ventilation is free and clear, which is super important.
Absolutely. I guess let's talk a bit about insulation stops, because we run into a lot of homes that don't have them. And I think that often people don't understand what they're for. And in this exact house, you know, having dropped all the insulation in this area now, we identified we had some issues with some of the rafters were twisted. We had a chance to address those before we put the drywall back up. Like you mentioned, the electrician was able to do his pot lighting grid a lot more easily. And we found a couple issues with junction boxes that weren't properly covered. And then we also noticed that we have no insulation stop. So I mean, here's the cardboard is one example of insulation stop, but if you could maybe explain a bit about what the purpose of the insulation stop is and how it functions.
Sure. I mean, an insulation stop's job really is just to stop the insulation from going into the soffit. So what it does is it creates that air gap. So at the top of that piece of cardboard, you can see, or that styrofoam that's there, essentially we call it like an upside down egg crate. It creates about a 2.5-inch gap where the insulation can be touching that baffle or insulation but not touching the roof deck. And so what it does is it preserves that air cavity so that fresh, cool, dry air can come up through there and feed the attic and help kind of stabilize it and get the moisture the way out, essentially, and to dry the attic. So you need that fresh air coming in or to cool it in the summer. And it stops the insulation from going past the wall plate and closing that off. So it's not atypical to not have them in a home that had wood chips because there's so little insulation in there. It wasn't above the height of the ceiling joists, so it wouldn't be blocking the soffit. More important is that they're not blocked. Definitely best practice is to use them. Sometimes you have houses where in like a really low slope corner where you can't physically access them. So it's not necessarily wrong to not have them in that corner. But you want to make sure you're preserving your soffit ventilation. And that's what they do, is they just keep a cavity of fresh air coming in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess, you know, in this home, like they had a vented soffit that was installed over top of an actual plywood soffit, non-vented. So, you know, in the 50s bungalow can be a little bit of a can of worms at times for making it perform in a way where you're mixing technologies a bit about old school and new. And that's where, you know, I think that, you know, the homeowner thought they had good venting in the home, and turns out they didn't have any venting there other than I think they had a whirlybird retrofit into the house at one point. So,
yeah, I think that, I mean, with every part of the renovation, it's the same. I think sometimes we fall into the trap of it's, you know, it's a 50s bungalow. It was bad before, it's going to be kind of bad after. Like you can't make it perfect necessarily. I think where we get into trouble is in each step along the way, everyone says that, and all of a sudden now you've added and changed the home, but you haven't really done the best job of it you can, and then all of a sudden you end up with 10 things that don't work. Absolutely. So in that one, for example, vented soffit, great, and maybe it never had any ice or attic rain issues or anything like that prior to, so it didn't have a lot of openings in the soffit. And so often we'll say, no, it shouldn't be that often, but it happens fairly often where a vented soffit goes over top. Now imagine you had vents before, and the thinking isn't necessarily wrong, is that, well, it's the same amount. We left those openings open, but now you're putting a screen over a screen.
Right.
So you're actually, you're reducing the volume of air that can get through that, making it harder for that air to get up and in. And then secondly, as you change the attic, by adding insulation, you may need to have more ventilation that was there. Maybe it didn't have enough to start. So yeah, that's not uncommon to have vented soffits over plywood. And the best practice for that is to cut them out entirely. You know, run a skill saw front to back all the way across, cut out as much as you possibly can. It's always better in those 50s bungalows, especially because you have such a small space for air. Often there's only an inch of space above the heel to where the roof deck meets. Not such an issue with new homes, but definitely something to be aware of in an older home.
Absolutely. And what about the actual roof vents themselves? So we see a couple different types here. So this has got a gable vent at the end. You can see that the grill at the end of the gable, and then you also have some roof vents. So we talked a bit about the purpose of the ventilation in the attic. So we talked about soffit venting. How does the roof vent work differently than a soffit?
So they work together, essentially. So you need cool, dry air to come into the attic, and you need a way for it to get out. It needs to be unrestricted. It should be ideally a straight line path from one to the other. So in the winter, you want cool air to come in, and as that sort of picks up what's inevitably going to be a bit warmer and more moisture-laden in the attic space, you have roof vents at the peak, and that's going to help get that air out. The risk of that picture that I see right there, my first thought will be that it's more likely that gable vent, like a triangular vent at the end there, is just going to vent into that roof vent. And so you may not actually have draw, like that roof vent that's at the peak there may not be drawing from the soffits because it's easier to just get air from that gable. And so without seeing the whole picture and knowing what's below it and around it, it may not be a problem. That gable vent might be decorative, but that's also kind of a common thing to think about if you have trouble in your attic. Often we're hearing about, add a bunch more vents, you need more ventilation. And that's not always necessarily true. And in fact, sometimes adding too much ventilation can make a problem worse because you start pulling moisture and pulling air out of your house. So it's about having balanced ventilation, equal parts at the roof and at the soffit.
Yeah. We'll hope that this gable vent is just decorative in nature. I mean, they covered up an old one perhaps, but You talked a bit about attic rain, and we get a lot of questions about that as well. So let's talk a bit about attic rain and what that is and what the cause of it can be. And I think in conjunction with attic rain, and we'll talk a bit about ice damming, because you can get, you know, you see a lot of houses around that look like this in the winter, and people tend to ignore it when it's a small amount, and then you get into a worst case scenario like this. But
Pretty bad.
we'll start off with the attic rain, and we'll get into the ice damming, and I guess they go a little bit hand in hand. But let's talk a bit about the attic rain. What's the cause of it, and what can someone do to prevent it, and what might be a solution to avoid it altogether?
Sure. Well, as far as what the specific cause of attic rain in terms of the moisture that's actually showing up in your home that you're seeing in your drywall or dripping through outlets and things like that, the real cause of it is just rapid melting of excessive frost in the attic or the walls. I probably lost it for a second there. So
oh, there you go.
You're getting the rain because that frost that built up is melting very quickly. It's not melting slowly enough that it can sublimate and be vented out and the attic can dry, and it's essentially overwhelming the house with too much moisture. So fast melting of excessive frost. Now, there's always going to be some frost in an attic. That's not atypical necessarily, but the building code essentially defines it as that frost can't be so much that moisture shows up in the home. So if you think about, our weather changes very quickly day to day. Some days can be really wet and warm and then freezing cold the next day. It's the same reason, like when you park your car outside and you come out in the morning and there's frost on it. Well, there's going to be frost on the roof deck of your attic also. And that's just a part of weather changing. Now, you don't want to have too much. And why you're getting attic rain is you have excessive frost. And what causes that excessive frost is generally two things, kind of holes or pressure. Holes meaning there's air leakage, so you're getting warmer, moisture-laden air is escaping into the attic, which is much colder, and then it's hitting that freezing cold roof deck and turning to frost. Or pressure can be a cause of that too. So that can be either a mechanical system maybe not balanced properly, so you're putting your house under positive pressure, and imagine pushing the volume of air out. And so every vapor barrier is designed to be an air and vapor barrier, hold air in, but not under pressure. So there's sort of limitations to that. So that pressure can often be either a mechanical system not balanced. Sometimes you have it where, for example, you changed an old B-vent furnace that was traditionally vented through a chimney, and the house was pretty leaky before, and so the pressure sort of balanced itself. And then you upgrade and you put some new vapor barrier on the walls, you tighten things up, new windows, and you put in a high efficiency furnace or a high efficiency water tank too. Now you don't have that kind of pressure being created, and you don't have that kind of balance. And sometimes now you put your house under positive pressure. So the short answer to that is holes and pressure. So either air leaking in because there's holes, whether it's not a vapor barrier, holes in the ceiling or around penetrations and things like that, or pressure is forcing that moisture-laden air into the attic, and then it's freezing. So yeah, those are the most common reasons you get frost building up. I would say the most kind of common bit of misunderstanding when it comes to attic rain is that it's ventilation. You need to add more vents is really common. You get customers calling and say, yeah, I had frost in my attic, I'm leaking this, and we put 10 more vents on, or we put a powered vent on, or something like that, because someone told them that, well, you got to vent that thing. It's not exchanging enough air. And it's very, very seldomly an issue of ventilation. It's almost always because of that air and moisture getting into it. So long as you have enough ventilation and it's balanced and not obstructed, then it's holes and pressure. Another common one, for example, is bathroom fans, like where the bathroom fan meets the roof deck. That's a really common source of air leakage, where if we get a heavy snow and that bathroom fan, like the gooseneck on the top of the roof, the vent, that's a perfect one. So in that one, it looks sealed, it's taped to the collar, everything looks great, but on the left side, you can see that there's a bit of deflection in that plate, and it's also not sealed to the roof deck. And so air is always going to find the easiest way, much like water. So let's say, for example, you got a big heavy snow that day and it covered up that vent. You turn on your bath fan, and because that air can find a way out the side, now you're taking really damp air, say after a shower or something like that, and pushing it into the attic. And so that's why you see that staining, that circular stain, and then icicle even forming. And in years like the last couple of years, when we get really, really cold, like deep freeze weather, where it stays cold for a long time and you never really get a chance for that frost to melt, either very cold or not a lot of sun, that's where you really start to see a lot of frost build up. And in the last 2 years, we've both the logs too have had those periods where we had like, a week to 14 days of very cold. And after that is almost guaranteed where you start to see the problems.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about vapor barrier again in a second here, but first let's talk about a giveaway item. I kind of snoozed on promoting this a bit here. So thanks so much, Bobby and Details Installation. They've donated a couple of Yeti coffee mugs here, or Ramblers, as well as a bag of Laker Co. coffee beans. And to qualify for the giveaway draw, you need to tell us what the R value per inch is of spray foam. Now, we haven't really talked about that yet, so you either know a lot about spray foam already or you need to learn something now. So I'll give you a hint. It's between 5 and 7. Just enter that into your comments. You're qualified for the draw. And let's talk a bit about now, we'll go back to this, the attic rain, and ventilation is a major part of it. And as a contractor, we get lots of requests to retrofit lighting, pot lighting grids, something like that into, into people's homes. Or we'll go and see that. And now the technology's changed a bit in pot lights. Now we use what's called a panel light, and they're only a ½ inch thick. So you don't need to go cutting and put these big recessed cans in like you used to. But we used to run into a lot of spaces where electricians had unknowingly, perhaps, just gone and cut through the vapor barrier all over the place. And then you end up with, major spots for warm air to rush into the attic. So one of our practices now, when we have to put a lot of pot lights into a home, especially on the second story, is we have a lot of wiring changes. We'll typically vacuum out the attic, and we're doing that with you guys now, one of our whole home renovations. And like we discussed earlier, the reason that we do that is so you have more access. It's easier to work. You're not crawling through a confined space with maybe some hazardous material. If you have vermiculite or something like that in your attic, we'll get back to vermiculite in a minute here. But one practice I like to do, and again, it's budget dependent, is if you can, after you drywall, you can then spray foam a couple inches, and that seals all the penetrations. It acts as a vapor barrier. And I guess, can you comment on that? Like, that's something that you guys do often?
Yeah, so we do a lot of, we call it building envelope repair. And so that can be very commonly is in condo buildings and townhomes and things like that maybe were built without a focus on air tightness, we'll say, and they end up having problems down the road. So either you can do the vapor barrier repair from the top and fix that vapor barrier conventionally with tapes, can foam, caulking, that kind of thing, and seal up those penetrations. Or in the case of maybe a large renovation, and I can actually use my own home for this one, oddly. We did a big renovation, did a whole bunch of pot lights, moved some walls, and effectively Swiss cheesed the whole ceiling. So at that point, short of dropping the ceiling and installing a new vapor barrier where you can be assured that it's going to be continuous, the best option we had was to spray down to the drywall. So we cut the existing vapor barrier out, got rid of that, sprayed down to the drywall, put 2 inches across it to get our air and vapor barrier, and the first R12, which is 2 inches, and R12, so 6 per inch. And then a little thicker around the outside to get the rest of the insulation that we needed. And so that can be a really good way in a large renovation where it's not practical to replace the vapor barrier, or the ceiling can't come down for a reason. Like maybe, for example, you had some asbestos in the ceiling and it wasn't in the budget to drop, but you didn't need to alter it. You can spray down to it and seal it up that way. So yeah, it's a really good way to seal up in a renovation. There's other ways to do it, but sometimes, as you know, in a renovation, it's not so much what looks doable on paper, but what's actually achievable in the field with good results. So yeah, that can be a really good one to spray down a couple inches just to seal it up. And then what we'll do there, instead of putting the full thickness or full R value required with spray foam, because there's a really significant cost associated with going past that depth, is we'll use 2 inches. We use the foam to seal it to be an air and vapor barrier, and kind of do the first bit, do the heavy lifting, we'll say. And then we use blown insulation, which is much less expensive per inch, to get the last bit of insulation in there. So you're kind of using, again, the best product for what they do best.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great solution. I'm a big fan of doing that way. But there's I mean, there's some significant costs that come with that, right? Like if you're not dropping your ceilings and you want to spray from above, then we're talking about, you're vacuuming out the attic, and that's, that's a significant cost and a big process in itself. But the advantage is, again, is now you have eyes on everything in that attic. What is the condition of, you can see where there was maybe leaks before now, you can see any wiring issues that might be there, any problems with any framing. So I love doing it because it helps get me to a best practice situation where I can address everything I need to. But,
for sure.
Not everyone's budgets are endless. So it can be cost prohibitive at times. And that's where we end up having to do some, do our best sometimes with what we have in front of us.
And that's not unusual in a case like that, especially if there's not a lot of insulation. Then it's like we acknowledge that we're not going to see every single penetration and know exactly what's there, but we know the most likely culprits. So, for example, that picture you showed of a chimney with a big gap beside it, we're going to look for big, obvious smoking guns like that. We're going to look for anytime a plumbing stack comes up and through the insulation, wiring if it happened to come up and through, because if it's going above the insulation, it's most likely a reno. So we're going to look for the big obvious stuff. Clear them away, expose it, seal it as best as possible, and put it back. So you can still make a big improvement. Is it the best? No, but it also doesn't fit every project. And maybe if a house, let's say, for example, they've lived in it for a long time, they've never had any issues, then maybe we don't need to take it all out. If the renovation didn't require that, still best practice on that would be to go and expose the obvious stuff, seal that up, make sure your attic hatch is sealed properly, bath fans. It's disheartening sometimes to see really beautiful homes or big renovations or large construction projects that are having big issues, staining in the ceilings, lots of moisture, and it honestly comes down to something as simple as a bathroom fan. Either A, it not being sealed properly, or B, it not being used properly in that it's really cold out, turn it on, have a shower, turn it off right away.
Right.
And so that pipe stays full of water, freezes, and then every time you do it, you get more and more water, and eventually it'll melt, and that's why you see or experience water dripping down from a bath fan. So there's definitely an in-between. Not every project is a full removal spray foam. Not everyone needs it.
Absolutely. We'll go back to this picture for a second because I think it's something that's common. And so here we removed some walls from a bungalow, and you can see the top plates were removed. And we pulled this out, and right away we had some wood chip fall on our head. And that's something that we knew because we did a check beforehand what was in that attic. But if you're ever doing a project, and I think most people have probably heard of Vermiculite by now, and what that is it's a type of insulation that was used. Well, I actually don't know when it was stopped being used, but you will run into it in 50s bungalows definitely, and it looks a little bit like a very fine gravel almost, or broken up asphalt type of granular product. So if you're planning a reno of any kind, you should be doing some testing in advance of what you have for materials before you do any demo. So if you're taking walls out, you need to check your drywall compound or your plaster and make sure you don't have asbestos. Same with your ceiling textures. But the same applies for your insulation. So if you go in your attic and you dig down through a few different layers, because surely it's been covered up by now, you might run across vermiculite. And this is one you don't want falling on your head. And when you run into this, you're now faced with, you basically have two choices. You are going to either abate at a significant cost, or you're going to, I call it encapsulate it, but you're going to just bury it in other layers, and you have to just kind of make note on a record. You now know you have this. And when you sell your home, you need to disclose that to the next buyer, right? So generally, when you guys run into a vermiculite on a site, how do you approach the process?
Well, I would say you can run into it even mixed in with wood chips. Sometimes it's not a very clear layer. It's not generally consistent. It's very common to have a corner that had it and a corner that doesn't. So when we do a removal, particularly in a home, pre-mid 80s, where that's a good possibility that it could have vermiculite, we'll always sort of warn that contractor or homeowner, like, hey, so this is what we're expecting. We see wood chips and fiberglass. If we run into fiber or vermiculite, from a safety point of view for us, we have to stop that removal. So we might back away from that corner. If it just happened in one area, go the other direction, because honestly, sometimes you'll see just a single bag of it dumped in the attic, which is bizarre, but it does happen. If it generally spread throughout, then that's going to be, we have to stop. There was a long time where vermiculite was considered to be a very low risk. Generally, when we have it tests at less than 0.1% concentration, which seems not like a lot. And so for a while, you could remove it conventionally. You could just take a vacuum and suck it up, be done with it. As we learned more about the product and the risk associated, that is no longer an option. So it's considered to be containing even when it's tested at less than 1/10%. And the biggest reason for that is it's very friable, meaning that it's very easy to get it airborne because it's not sealed together. It's very dusty, super easy to get airborne. And the other risk with it is what's called silicates. So not a carcinogen. That said, still a pretty significant risk to your health. So it's always abatement if it's coming out. There is no shortcut on that. Abatement means pre and post air testing to make sure the air quality of the house is unaffected. It means removing it and then what's called gluing it down. So essentially spraying a glue over the whole space. Now, that's something that we don't do. We think that, I guess our opinion on that is that abatement is a pretty critical task, and it's something that you need to be doing all the time. Be well versed in changes and best practices, and do it properly. Because whether you do it well or poorly, it's still very costly. And so that's something. When it's there, we leave it. As far as blowing new insulation over top, generally, if there's a product over top of it, I would just leave it as is. Is how we treat it. The risk of going in and adding new layers is, imagine, like, the reason we're not touching it is because we don't want it to become airborne. But now you go in and add a new layer with that, basically a big giant air hose. So you're exposing yourself in that house to risk by doing it. So if there's vermiculite, our guidance is always either do a full abatement, so you have that cleared and you can move forward and not have it, or leave it exactly as is. Don't change anything. Know that you might not have the most efficient attic in the block. You may pay a little bit more for your heat, but better to leave it and better to not expose yourself to risk in working in it.
It's not
the
worth
abatement
it.
cost is pretty significant.
Yeah, absolutely. And like abatements, whether you're taking out your drywall or your vermiculite or whatever, one of the biggest costs is the containment of it and making sure that it's safe to remove, and the air quality testing during and after and all that process, right? So there's a lot to it. Generally, when we find vermiculite, it's already been covered in a few different layers of insulation.
Right.
So generally, we just would come in and we'll top up to our current, code over top of it all without having to disturb it. The biggest challenge becomes when you're planning a reno, when you're taking walls out, and you need to disturb that top plate within the ceiling in a bungalow, especially, or in a second story. Well, then if you can't wait to find out you have it when it's falling on your head, because now you've got a bigger problem. Right?
Yeah. Now the risk would be that you've contaminated the space you're working in, and I mean, it's not uncommon. It is all over the place, and a brief encounter with it is probably not going to be the end of the world. I think from how we see it, it's just from a liability point of view, and it's just best to have it removed or leave it in place.
Yeah.
Wherever possible.
Yeah, just do your research. Ultimately, when you're planning any sort of project, large or small, you're doing it yourself, or if you're hiring a contractor, you're hiring that contractor to do the research for you, right?
Definitely.
There should never be a surprise that, oh my goodness, we've run into it, unless of course you find some encapsulated layer somewhere that you couldn't tell until you got into demo. It's different, but as far as insulation goes, it's pretty easy to test early on. We do it as part of our design agreement process, where we're finalizing design and pricing. We come in and we do some test cuts here and there, and we do some sampling at that stage, just to make sure that, we've ruled that out, because it can have a major impact upon someone's budget. And that might be a game changer for their whole project. If you now have to go put, $15,000 into abatement, and your budget was $75,000 for your kitchen, well, now,
stings for sure.
Yeah, it can really have an impact on it. So anyhow, I guess, let's transition into talking about the different products that are out there that are, that are available we'll talk about wall insulation for now. And there's a lot of discussion and questions we get around, fiberglass pink versus what's now called rockwool, used to be roxol. And let's talk a bit about the difference, why one costs more, what the pros and cons are. So this is rockwool. When you see this stuff installed, it's typically kind of a greenish or gray color. It is a higher cost product than you would see from a fiberglass pink. What's the difference between the two? And can you explain a bit about why it's priced differently, what the advantages or disadvantages are?
I would say, so first off, one of fiberglass is a spun fiber, so it's fiberglass. It's generally the less expensive of the two, and typically a lower R value per inch. So that's, it's good product, used all over the place. The biggest downside of it is that if it's not adequately sealed with a really well-detailed vapor barrier, it essentially just becomes a filter. And so while it may stop heat in one way, but it's letting air through the other. So it doesn't really win on that category, but really any conventional insulation relies on a vapor barrier. So a little bit lower R value per inch typically. There are now some new fiberglass products that came out of the code revisions that are more expensive, that can match that R value a little bit. That's a perfect picture. You can see that insulation in that top part that's all blackened. And a lot of people think that's mold and get really worried when they see that, but generally that just goes to show that fiberglass, which was in those joist end cavities in between the floor, previous to the foam, a whole bunch of air has been moving through that, and that's just taking the dust and dirt out of the air and turning it black, much the same as your furnace filter.
Yeah, we see that all the time, and people always go, "Oh my goodness, black mold," and it's like, no. It's just very dirty insulation from lots of air movement. And then wonder, well, how can air move in there? Well, your vapor barrier, or you have a penetration, or something is letting air into the cavity, and it's filtering through your insulation.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So Roxol, or now rockwool, bit more of a premium product. I would say the biggest advantages to it is it does a really good job at shedding moisture. I mean, no conventional insulation is designed to be waterproof or anything like that. If you cut a little channel in Roxol, you can almost run water down it because it's a rock slag, is what it's made from. So a little bit better with moisture. If you had some incidental moisture, a leak, it's going to fare a little bit better. If it's saturated, you're going to have the same issue as any insulation. It's going to come out and get replaced. The R value is typically higher because it's rock wool. It does really well under flame spread testing and fire testing, which is great. The other thing is it's denser. So what that means is that it's going to stop a little bit more air on its own. Again, it's not designed to stop air, but just as a default of it being denser, less air is going to travel through it, which is a good thing. And then the last thing that people really tend to like about fiberglass rockwool is it tends to perform better from a sound attenuation point of view. So a little bit better in the walls, a dense product. It's stopping some of that ambient noise. We kind of look at Roxol or rockwool as a nice intermediate product where maybe the priority or budget isn't to get to the most efficient system possible. Rockwool can be a really great product as long as you have a great vapor barrier and well-detailed wall. There's nothing wrong with that product whatsoever. And it's kind of a halfway between where you're not into the world of spray foam yet, but it's certainly better, denser, better, performs better than fiberglass. But it comes at maybe about half the cost of spray foam.
Yeah. And we use it a lot for soundproofing and whatnot, as like you mentioned. It's a good product, and it's a lot easier to handle than fiberglass as well, in my opinion. I guess we'll do last call on our giveaway. So thank you, Bobby, and Details Insulation for these couple of Yeti Ramblers. We have that as well as a Laker Co. bag of coffee beans. And to qualify for the giveaway item, what is the R value per inch of spray foam? 6. But if you just can enter that into the comments, you'd be qualified for the draw. We'll do the draw in about probably 5 minutes. And you can either come get them from Details or from my office. We'll work that out after the fact. So,
sure.
Yeah. So I guess let's talk a bit about now what options are for roof insulation or attic insulation. Sorry. So what would you consider to be the most popular product that you're putting in now when someone, either in new build, I guess. Let's talk a bit about that. What are you putting in generally, and I think R60 is code now, I understand?
Sort of. So for an attic, R60 is the requirement if you don't have an HRV, which is really uncommon for new builds. If you have an HRV system, then that code is reduced then to R50. So 50 or 60, depending on your mechanical system. I would say most commonly we see 50 because almost every new home has an HRV, which is a really great thing to add to maintain your quality of air in your home and balance, fresh air, all that stuff. It's great. And almost all homes have it now. Yeah. So yeah, 50 or 60. We install primarily fiberglass. I think there's really only two viable options for blown insulation, which is fiberglass, which is same product as in the batt form that goes into the wall. There's just no binder in it, so it doesn't stay together. It looks like just kind of loose cotton. Or blown cellulose, which is essentially a recycled newspaper with some additives to it to make it safe from a fire perspective and not quite as attractive to rodents for the first period of time. when it comes to fiberglass and cellulose, it's kind of one of those things in our industry that it's sort of like a Chevy versus Ford. There are guys that are very passionate about it on one side or the other, and they will go to the end of the world to tell you why one doesn't work and the other one does, or reverse. I just don't believe in that. I don't think that's the case. I think that there are arguments against both. There are advantages and disadvantages to both. More important than what product that you pick is that it's installed properly. You can do a bad job of fiberglass and a bad job of cellulose, and neither one's going to work well. If they didn't work, they wouldn't be on the market. Right. In our experience, fiberglass is it's a cleaner product. It's an easier product to work with. And so what that means, if you're not in the act doing the install, it might not matter to you, but the easier and more consistent the product is that the guy's working with or the installer is working with, generally the better quality job you're going to have, which does matter to you in the end. So that's kind of how I see it. Either one works. I don't know, market share, they're probably fairly similar. I think fiberglass is a bit more popular. There are more options, more distributors versus Edmonton. There's only one for cellulose. Both are good. Both have some advantages and disadvantages, but most important is that you're picking someone that you trust to install it properly. And it's not just the right depth, it's also the right density so that it doesn't settle to being half its depth a month or two later after the inspection. I think that matters more.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, that's a great point. I think that generally now, I think it's reasonably safe to say there aren't too many completely crap products out there in the market anymore. Most of them get, they don't last long when they come out. It's not a good product. Nobody stand by you. Lots of complaints. I think it's all about the quality of the install and making sure people are following best practice and doing the job right. So I think, more than getting stuck in the debate between fiberglass or cellulose or all this different stuff, it's who you selecting to handle your install, right? Like anything, whether it's your, like your faucet, sure, you can go and spend $1,000 on a really fancy, brand name faucet. You can buy something inexpensive from Rona or Home Depot, or I think generally maybe one will last longer, but you need a plumber to install it properly for you, or you might end up with a leak, which creates way more challenges. Same would apply for your installation, obviously. For sure. And it's funny, like I often in my jobs, and everyone's got a budget and a limitation on their spend, and I understand that and I respect it. But what I don't like, it's often we're asked to do things like put in like super expensive countertops while we completely ignore an infrastructure issue like a plumbing, a wiring or an insulation issue. Yeah. And to me, that's not an okay trade-off. I think that you can come back in a couple of years and upgrade your countertop. You can't go back later and upgrade your wall insulation without major costs. So I think, in this day and age now, there's too much that's designed to be disposable. I think with our homes, we need to really be careful about quality of work, best practice, doing it right, make your home efficient and work well, make it safe. And then, you can make it pretty, no problem, but don't spend all your money on the pretty. And I think it's not uncommon
that we run into that. I mean, insulation is not the most exciting part of a renovation. I guess how I look at it is it's easy to make that decision in the midst of it when you're choosing where that money is going to go, and everything's finite. And if I had to pick between nicer countertops, I could understand that. And it's easier to make that decision if you've not been a part of a renovation after a reno was done and there's been a problem. Absolutely. And you've seen beautiful new reno, great floors, but unfortunately it's all soaked because you had a bunch of attic rain or whatever that might be. And that could be roof, siding. That argument can be made all the way around. But I think it's important to look at it as a whole. And when you're investing in a renovation like that, certainly want to invest in the systems in the envelope that protect that reno so that you're not redoing it the next year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. I think that's one thing that gets, because it's behind the walls or out of sight, sometimes it doesn't get enough attention, and it's a critical part of the home and how it performs, right? So
very problematic to upgrade after the fact usually.
Absolutely. So if you're a homeowner and you're considering an insulation upgrade, or you don't even know if you need one, you aren't too sure, maybe have some problems, you've had some attic rain or some ice damming, your house is drafty, I think it's important you call someone like Bobby at Details. His information's on the screen. Give them a shout. They can come troubleshoot things for you. And like we talked about a minute ago, it's all about the quality of work that's done. It's hard to keep an eye on your insulation contractor, so you got to hire someone that you know and can trust, and that has a reputation that you can count on, because often at that stage, that type of work like that, you won't know if it wasn't done right until it fails later and it's caused damage elsewhere in the home. So, you know, I would say
it's not generally the most pleasant place to be around, in particular in an attic. Well,
no.
one thing that we try to be open to, and I think you've seen that from us, Paul, is that we generally invite people to come by our office, come see our office, see how we operate, see our trucks, how we take care of our staff. All that stuff matters. I mean, frankly, whatever type of installation we're doing, whether it's blown insulation, spray foam, honestly, it's just not an easy job. It's a hard, hot, difficult job. And so really important is to take care of your team, to treat them well, to provide them with the tools and equipment they need to do the best work possible. And then the other thing that we do, which we're really big on, and you've seen from us too, Paul, is that in particular in a large renovation or a new build, you know, there's an installation inspection often for renovations, sometimes not, new builds always, is that we like to bring in a third party to do a pre-drywall performance test. So what that does is we'll put the house under pressure with what you see there is a blower door, basically a big fan connected to a computer, so we can monitor the pressure of the house. And what that does is basically give us an opportunity to pull in air from outside, which is at a different temperature. And so we use a combination of that blower door, infrared imaging, smoke testing, to go around and to check, you know, common issues. Even, you know, it'll show us if windows are failing, though it's not our scope, it's part of the build. And we really look at our job as like having that extra step where we come in, and that's not required, certainly not a code requirement at all. But that's one of the things that really differentiates us. Like, we want to know that installation's done and sealed properly, because there's no other way to see if it's failing until it's ruined a finish down the road. What it also does too is it gives us an opportunity, and we always invite the general or the owner to come through that third-party testing. You know, we're not shy about it. We're not perfect. We work to get better every day, and we're gonna see things in that test that we can improve. At the same time, though, the builder or owner or contractor is going to see things, maybe it's, you know, the windows, steel beam, intersection, things like that, that we can work together on to improve that build for the next time. And so, yeah, doing that third-party testing is something we really believe in, and it gives us a chance to basically check our work before the environment does it, and know that we're passing on the best possible result we can. And in a renovation, you know, in an area that maybe isn't part of the scope, maybe we can't make a difference there, but we know that what we've done as both as a general contractor and as a subcontractor, what we've done is done as well as it can be. So yeah,
Absolutely.
We really believe strongly in that.
Yeah, and I appreciate, like, the last house you did for us, you know, we got afterwards a link to a Google Photos album showing all the work, that all the acoustic seal was done, that we had, it was all done properly, right? And you documented that and shared that with me. And as a general contractor, that's great. I mean, we send our site supers out to check on the work regardless, but to have you be proactive about it, to bring it to me in advance, you know, it certainly is reassuring before the drywall crew shows up and covers it all. And once it's covered,
honestly, it's between,
way harder to follow up and check, right? I mean,
so yeah, it's hard to see after, and also even when it, like, we might have, like, the inspector, let's say the city sends an inspector by and it looks fine, and that's not atypical necessarily to go through a blower door inspection, and it might look fine, but we see a thermal signature that we don't like, or, you know, a trail of smoke that we don't like, and despite it looking fine to my eyes or to someone else's eyes, it's not until we put it under pressure and essentially create the worst case scenario for a house, we simulate it, that we see what can be improved. So even though it might look fine to even a trained set of eyes, until it's under pressure or use infrared, you really can't be sure how it's going to perform. So it's just an extra step. You know, we don't build in a very easy climate where we have huge swings in temperature and very, very different seasons throughout the year. So insulation is a really big part of that, and I guess we just want to learn each time and do a little bit better.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much, Bobby.
You're welcome.
Great to have you on the show. You've been watching the Art of Renovation Live. I'm your host, Paul Foster from Contract Renovation to Custom Homes. If you're planning a project, you need some help, we're happy to give you a hand with avoiding landmines out there within whatever your project might be. If you need a trade and you don't need a general, we'll direct you to great people like Details Insulation. The winner of the mugs today is BJB Wood Shop. I don't know if you know those guys. Friends of yours?
Do.
All right. Well, that's great. Congratulations, guys.
Congratulations.
You will get a hold of you and get your instructions set up to go pick them up from Bobby. So, yeah, so tune in. We do the show every week on Tuesday at 1. We'll probably switch to monthly into the fall. It's a lot of work to do the show every week. I really enjoy it, but I have another job to do as well. you know, renovations is what I love most. We'll do new builds, but I love the reno. I love the transformation. There's a lot of problem solving, and it's all about helping people do it right. And that's what I love about my job. So need a hand, give me a shout. You want to learn some more, just tune into the show. They're all up on our YouTube channel or on IGTV. You can go back, use them as a point of reference. Thanks so much for joining. Thanks, Bobby.
You're welcome.
Art of
Thanks.
Renovation Live. We'll see you next week, Tuesday.